So welcome to the LINX Distinguished Speaker Series. My name is Norana Nimpono. I am the Head of Global Engagement at LINX, and I'm moderating today's session. So welcome to all of you watching it live and all of you watching it on YouTube afterwards. We are also putting this content into an upcoming podcast, so it will be available in all sorts of formats for you. So the LINX Distinguished Speaker Series is a series of talks gathered here at LINX by experts in the industry who have deep knowledge and expertise and often a unique perspective on a particular subject. So for those of you watching it live, do feel free to use the chat to chat amongst yourself and also to ask questions to the panelists. We do want to keep it interactive, so don't be shy, but we're also conscious of the time, given that we've got some excellent speakers for you today. And it is my great pleasure to introduce today's panelists: Andrew Sullivan, CEO of ISOC, Jari, Arkko, former chair of the ITF with the IAB and senior researcher at Ericsson, Claffy, founder and director at CAIDA, and Geoff, chief scientist at APNIC. And today we are going to explore whether or not the internet model still holds, or is it fit for the future, or is it creaking at the seams? So we'll be exploring a few different things, and I'm thinking we'll just jump straight into the meat of it. So, I'm going to actually throw the very first question at you, Jari, given your background within the ITF and your current involvement there still. So, we're using technology that's 50 years old, and you gave a presentation as part of the LINX Distinguished Speaker Series a few weeks ago saying that it's remarkable how well it's held up, and actually the COVID and the strains that it's put on the internet has actually shown that it's still working quite well, and it's even managed to change and evolve over time. So can you talk a little bit about that? Why do you think that the internet architecture that we still have today works, and how does it meet current challenges?
Yeah, thank you. I think it does work, and of course, like for any complex situation or system, there's probably no single yes or no answer. It doesn't work or does work. It's a complex system with many parts that some are doing better than others. But at least from my personal perspective, I've been quite amazed in recent years about some of the developments that we've seen. A few years ago, I didn't think that we would ever move away from TCP, but I think we're seeing that happen with QUIC, which also provides some promise of further changes happening easier because you don't have to update the kernels all over the place. And I thought it would take a long time to put end-to-end security for all communications, but it actually happened fairly quickly. It went from 20% to 80% in a matter of a couple of years, helped by the Snowden revelations, I guess, some technology improvements, and also business reasons. And as you mentioned, Nurani, also this year's events, COVID-19 has been a big thing, not just for the whole societies and people, but also for the network in terms of changes in traffic flows, like where they go, what applications people actually need to be using, even the direction of traffic or the location of people where they're sending this traffic or receiving the traffic has changed. And by and large, I think we managed reasonably well, not perfectly, many problems. And in general, there's like tons of challenges left in the internet, of course. For instance, just because we add some security mechanism somewhere, for instance, the end-to-end security doesn't mean that we've solved all security problems. But maybe we'll get to the list of problems later in this panel. So I'll hand it over back to you.
Let's get to it straight away, I think. Well, I know that, I mean, it's a good point that there, what is good enough, or how quickly should things change. And I know that, Geoff, you gave a presentation as part of a series a few weeks ago where you were criticizing the pace of technology adoption. So tell us, and you mentioned IPv6 and DNSSEC as examples that have not really been adopted as quickly as we thought. I think IPv6 is certainly one of the ones that we can all agree on. We thought should have at least happened many years ago. what are your thoughts on Jari's views here?
Look, you have to sort of reach a little bit back in history, fortunately or unfortunately, to actually understand what's going on here. And I'd like to reach back to 1874. There was a meeting in Bern that started the General Postal Union. Now, what was going on was that the post was a mess because the receiver paid. Here's a letter. Do you want it? Well, if you say yes, you're going to have to pay. And so all these European countries got together and called themselves general, global, universal, and decided that what they would do is institute a bilateral set of arrangements where no one would pay anyone. I would accept your money, thank you, and I would pass your mail off to, say, Andrew or Jari or Kim, and say, here's some letters, please deliver them. I'm not going to pay you. But in exchange, I'll take your letters and deliver them for free. Fair enough. Along comes the telephone. Thank you, Alexander Graham Bell. And actually along comes the next one, the International Telecommunications Union, grew out of the telegraph. And it instituted the same degree of international bilaterals, but they were better. They did settlements. But what it did also was that it completely stultified what national phone companies could provide, because it was defined in a set of international agreements. So every single provider was locked into a technology, and to do something madly, insanely innovative like the fax actually required a huge set of conferences and agreements. The internet was never built by committee, and new IP, which is trying to be built by committee right now as we speak, is a complete disaster on wheels. It's never going to happen because crusty old men in dirty smoke-filled rooms, no matter where you meet, Geneva or anywhere else, isn't going to define what gets offered in a marketplace. And the one thing the internet did was get rid of this idea of command-based economies and replace it with private investment. What does that mean? We offer what users are willing to pay for. And more to the point, we innovate when it creates a service that's cheaper. So the entire technology of innovation is actually the economics of innovation. And what actually happens is, I'll compete with you in a market, Narani, and if my prices are about the same and you're the incumbent, you win. What if I'm a tenth of your price? Ha, I win. What if I go so cheap, it's free? Oh, you and I both lose because the market's been destroyed. And you actually find again and again and again that users are actually determining what happens here. And this is completely about the economics of innovation. The technology, oddly enough, is incidental. So when you get a technology like V6, which is a great piece of infrastructure, but does nothing for users, it's still packets. Nothing happens. And nothing happens because the drivers aren't there. So when we shifted from command economy to actually real economies, where private investors invest money for users to pay for, all of a sudden the focus shifts from technology to this amazing focus on the user. If I'm the provider, Narani, I'm deeply interested in you, but it's nothing personal. I'm deeply interested in what you are going to spend because I want a slice of it. And so this drives a huge amount of today's internet.
All right, quite a few interesting points then. I want to get back to the market. I want to get back to new IP, and I want to get back to what drives change in the internet. But if you don't mind, Casey, maybe I'll get to you, Andrew, in just a second, because I'm sure you've got some reactions to that too. But I know that you're from the research community, and you've actually looked at what's happening in the internet. And I watched a really interesting presentation from you, Casey, 6 years ago, trying to predict the future and basically looking at what research you had in front of you. And you talked about, for example, that you didn't think there would be widespread adoption of IPv6. I think there will be some adoption. I think that's true. I think you said the same with DNSSEC. You talked about the IP transfer market, that was going to happen. But based on data, because I know that you're a data person, and you've said that if we can't measure it, we can't understand it. So if we leave the market drivers and all those for now, what can you see in your research that drives adoption of new technology? And do you have any other thoughts on what Geoff just said?
Let's see. Well, a lot of thoughts, but yeah, I am a data-driven personality, I think, and I do operate in a data-driven world. So in the internet space, it's really more about trying to predict the present than predict the future, because it's so hard to get data. And my feelings about IPv6 have always come from just looking at the data that I could get about v6, where it frankly never looked like it was taking off to me. And I got in a lot of trouble back in the 90s and the noughts for saying it doesn't look to me like it's happening, because there was a lot of people who just thought, well, you're not looking at the right data. Obviously it's happening. So that's fine. It's true that researchers don't have access to a lot of data that industry does have access to. But I think a lot of the consternation that happens is because we do lack that shared vision of what the present is like, never mind what the future is going to be like. And so you end up with, in lieu of data, people sort of going to their ideological corners about what should be, or if they're in a marketing department, what they need their company to have it be. And that's, I think, gotten us in quite a bit of trouble and ends up with polarized discussions about things. So, I mean, it's not going to be surprising for me to say it because I've devoted my life to that, but I really think the answer to a lot of the problems that we're facing is, let's look at the data, let's get better data, let's think about how to measure appropriately, soundly, and how to interpret the data reasonably, and let's get a lot of independent parties able to make the same claims about data so that we can trust that it's objective.
Thank you. All right, I'll throw, and I'm getting a little bit distracted by the chat because there are a few interesting comments there about innovation and ossification of the internet. But I'll move to you, Andrew, and maybe we can talk about, if we talk about the current challenges, and we talk about not just the internet architecture that we've used for the last 50 years, but we talk about this internet model of networking. Could I ask you first of all to explain that and talk about whether or not are there inherent things or qualities in that model that drive certain changes or not?
Thanks. So I think one of the fundamental, I mean, the framing of this panel is whether it's fit for the future or bursting at the seams. And I think the point that all of Jari, Geoff, and Casey have made in different ways already tells us that the answer is both. It's always been both. It's always been late. Everything's always late, and it's always broken for whatever you needed right now. But the challenge is that there's always this pressure, and that's because it is very much centered around, what is it that people need now, and if I can deliver that, more cheaply, or if I can deliver something that you want, then you're going to do it, you're going to use it, and now we'll have a new service on the internet. And that has happened over and over and over again. And I think one of the simple problems that we have with a lot of these predictions, or predicting the present, I really like that that phrase, is that we have a misapprehension a lot of the time of what people actually want, and architects like to sit back and say, but this is what people need, eat your spinach. The V6 promotion has been eat your spinach for the entire time. And the real question is, well, does somebody really need this? And we find actually that when they do, they pick it up. And that's actually where this internet model that the Internet Society keeps talking about is, that's where it lives. Because the internet is this distributed system, it's a network of networks all the way down. What happens is that people solve the problems that they have. They solve the things it's what they used to say in the open source world, right, or the free software movement. They would say, well, you scratch your own itch. And that's a feature of the way the internet gets built too. And because it's this network of networks that allows people to innovate locally, allows people to work within their own needs, it delivers advantages to people who have the same need. And it turns out that for a lot of people around the world, they have the same need. And if all you need to do is agree on a common protocol to scratch that itch, the itch scratching protocol version 1, then you can all implement it the same way, and you don't need central coordination. And that was the really big advantage of the internet model, as opposed to, for instance, the centralized telco model. That it was really easy for people to just do what they wanted to do, and you want to do it, and I want to do it, then we just do it. We don't need to get permission from anybody. Not needing to get permission, and especially not needing to get permission from the network, is the advantage that leads us to the next opportunity. And so I completely agree. I worked on, V6, I worked on DNSSEC, I worked on these things over time, various deployments and all the rest of it. And yeah, sometimes you feel like you're beating your head against the wall. But it's also okay to say, well, apparently people didn't want that. It turns out they wanted this other thing over here, and now we've got it. And some of the things that people want are not necessarily the things that I wish they would want, but nobody died and made me boss. And I think that's the central point about what the internet way does. It gives the ability to make these decisions to individuals. And if enough individuals want a thing, we find that that's something that tends to take off. And for that reason, I think Casey's point about data is really important. That if you want to understand what's going on, you need to look at what people are actually doing, and that's okay. That's not a bug. We keep talking about it as though it's some sort of problem. Oh, the architecture is wrong. No, if it satisfies the needs that people have, then it's working. And sometimes that isn't beautiful. The new IP proposals that Geoff mentioned, a lot of that has to do, a lot of the motivational documents that I've read about that, frequently their complaint is basically, well, the architecture is wrong. Okay. But this one's working and it's already shipped. So what is it that you're bringing to the party? And I think that question is the one that we need to ask about these things all the time, because that to me is one of the problems when people start criticizing the architecture as being, as not satisfying the needs of people. I am skeptical about that, since I think if people really had that need, somebody would have shipped it already.
So let me pick up on that, because I think it was also actually one of the questions I asked to Geoff when he gave his presentation about technology adoption. So, this thing about the user needs and the marketplace solving it, it's an argument that's been used and in claiming that that's what brought down the monopolies of the past. And now we have this beautiful ecosystem of different, I know one of your colleagues, Andrew Olaf Kolkman, likes to talk about different players at different layers. And we've got this lovely ecosystem of meeting the needs of lots of different people in using the internet. But can we, first of all, can we really say that model works and leads to something we need if, first of all, we've got a big part of the population still not connected to the internet, they still don't have access to the internet? The other is that, we said that that's what led to the takedown of the monopolies, but are we not looking now at a new form of monopolies, the hyperscalers moving not just in one layer, but lots of different layers, building infrastructure, managing infrastructure, not being dependent on transport providers, providing services on top of that infrastructure. So that was one of the, so Andrew Blum gave a presentation at LINX meeting, basically talking about that the hyperscalers are fundamentally changing the way we manage, build, operate the internet. does this marketplace of user needs, etc., does that actually solve the problems of the users, and or has that not led to the situation we have now? And are there not challenges with that? And I'll put that to all four of you. Whoever unmutes first.
Well, I mean, I can respond to it if you like. The fundamental fact that the internet provides an architecture by which local needs can be satisfied it's not magic, right? It doesn't mean that every user need is going to be satisfied all the time, because there are economic questions involved. There are and also there's this question about how markets work, right? I mean, the usual sort of cartoon version of how markets work is, some sort of like Hayek, a perfect competition and information symmetry and all the rest of it. And that is, like just empirically false. So it's not the case that this is some sort of magic that just solves the thing. What it is that it tells us that there's a feature here that is better than the command and control approach that historically was taken. In many cases where access is a problem, just to pick on it, the problem actually is still that we've got command and control people who are desperately trying to make sure that what is good for the users is whatever this telco or that telco says it is. That's a really fundamental problem. We continue to have problems having to do with spectrum hoarding, for instance, by incumbents who have the spectrum and won't let anybody use it because that's good for their future and it's good for their balance sheet, but it isn't particularly good. It isn't particularly good for getting the access to people who are in remote communities and so on. What we need instead is to recognize that the feature of the network model, of the internet way, that is really valuable has to do with this local demand-driven model of development. And then we need to build on that. And that does mean we need to make sure that there are not centers of power, whether they be telcos, governments, giant corporations, whoever, who can squeeze that thing and put change the scales in their favor. That's the real trick.
I have a question from the audience, but yes, please, Jari, go ahead.
Yeah, I just wanted to add that the observation that if we have this situation where the internet has beaten the telco world, the old telco world, and user needs are being fulfilled, it doesn't imply that there wouldn't be some other issues. So I think we actually have like a multi-dimensional problem or multiple issues. So we might actually have the case that we have a little bit too much power in some hands or too large entities, even if user needs are being filled and other inferior models had been beaten in the past. So I think we actually have to watch all of this carefully. And when it comes to this consolidation, I actually like to talk about like two separate issues. One is this business aspect that two large entities controlling big part of the market, and then centralization that like we're moving towards this centralized designs. There's only one cloud or three, and I can ask each one of them. But if the one that I pick goes down, then lots of people are going to be unhappy. Or Quad 8 goes down, lots of people are going to be unhappy. So I think we do need to worry about this.
So I know, Casey, I want to throw in Andre's question because I think it's a one I want to pick up on. But Casey, I might ask you that you've written some papers on this, how the internet is changing, and what kind of regulation you think is needed in the sort of new world compared to the old internet that we used to have. Do you have any thoughts that you want to share on that?
Yeah, although mostly I might point people to a paper that Dave Clark and I wrote last year, but I'll leave that for the end. I mean, there's been a lot of talk about this whole demand-driven model of the internet, but I do think it's important to remember the history of the internet in contrast to the telephony history, because people keep comparing it, but the history is critically different here, right? Telephony started as essentially a discovery by a private individual or set of private individuals, or two competing groups of private individuals, depending on how you look at it. And then it developed on its own in the private sector until it became sufficiently recognized as important that the government came in, and this is an oversimplification because of course the private sector was involved in these conversations too, but decided, oh, this is sufficiently important. Everyone in society should have access to this technology. Therefore, we're going to regulate it. We're going to make sure that this social aspiration, which is in fact more important than whatever technology is used to deploy it, is met. And that's where you got the original Telecom Act back in 1934, I think. The internet, in contrast, and by the way, all those regulations that were put in place to make sure you had universal access and even price regulations. I mean, it was a whole different world, but those were the regulations that enabled, among those regulations included ones that enabled the internet to be created and evolve and the telcos not be able to stop it. By the way, we don't have that in place today. So people who think there's going to be a new internet, it's not clear to me how it's going to evolve. The other thing I think is missing from the praise of the internet architecture as what enabled all this innovation, because people keep using the word distributed as the magic word there. I don't think distributed is the magic word there. In fact, distributed seems tautological to me with internet, because you have to connect things. The point is to connect things across regions. I think the magic word is open, and open is a little too broad. I think the magic word is that the intellectual property is accessible to all. And so I spent 10 years with a bunch of academic research groups trying to build new internet, studying new internet architectures, the name data networking in particular. And we got blocked pretty quickly on intellectual property problems with trying to develop the architecture. So I think folks who really think, well, we're going to need something to replace IP, they're going to have to contend with that. The real weapon that IP had, and I'm not knocking the contribution of packet switching. It's gargantuan. It's the greatest intellectual contribution, I think, maybe in the 20th century. But that's not why it succeeded. That was, maybe you could argue, necessary and not sufficient. And I know that Geoff has written in his, or at least had in his talk commentary about how, well, we've retrofitted circuit switching back into packet switching. And I think that goes to Jari's point is, and Andrew's point is, well, we do what we need to do. The market does what it needs to do to deliver the services that ultimately are what consumers demand, and what providers can cost effectively provide to meet that demand. But I think the fundamental, the power that IP had was not in the internet protocol, it was in the intellectual property framework that surrounded it. So I see Geoff shaking his head, so maybe he'll argue with me on that. Now that's separate. Oh, go ahead.
Look, I think there's two issues going on in the marketplace. One is that challengers want to innovate. And part of the issue of that challenge is to challenge the incumbency. And incumbents want to resist the challenge. And so in some ways, there's this pressure between a new entrant trying to capture market share with either the same technology or a better production process or whatever that they believe attracts users, and the incumbents trying desperately hard to stop the market leak. And so these pressures start to build up. Now, when you have a technology like the internet, like any communications technology, you increase the projection of power. The telephone created multinationals. They were never going to exist in the letter age. And equally, the internet has created these massive vertically integrated factories because the projection of power is both geographical, but also extent of markets, that you now get a very small amount of players with extraordinarily reach, market share, and power. Then what actually happens is the resistance to change from those incumbents becomes very, very high. And instead of a continuous process of innovation and a continuous rotation of seats, what you actually find is the incumbents get, well, we call it araldite, but that's probably a different, glued to the seat of incumbency and market share. And what blows them up is then almost revolutionary, because the pressures just build and build and build until the monopoly rentals become so high, it all falls apart. Look at the destruction of the telephone world. In marketing terms, it was the fact that, the pressures got so high, monopoly rentals got so high, the internet was always going to happen at the time it happened. And the fault or the gain was not the internet. The fault was actually with the incumbent telcos. And so not only is there this user pressure, one side, so users want cheaper product, better product, good on them. At the same time, incumbents, oddly enough, don't. They maximize their profit by not. And so they're desperately trying to resist the pressures of innovation at the same time. And so you get this sort of massive struggle. Now, normally that's just fine. Markets operate just fine. But when the projection of power gets overwhelming, and today is no exception to where we are, those dynamics become difficult. And that's where the public interest and the regulators start to move in with, in the US, it was the antitrust issues and the Sherman Act. To counter this extraordinary power of large companies, and JP Morgan, General Electric, US Steel, we're not new. And this situation is not new in these markets. And the current, actions by the US, part of the cut and thrust here. But don't forget, incumbents have their own economic power, and it's not necessarily the power of innovation, it's actually the power of resistance. The monopoly rentals are so good, they're seductive.
Can I respond to that?
Yes, please, go ahead.
I mean, first of all, nothing you said is inconsistent with what I said. We need to drill down here, except for the part that the laws didn't matter. The regulations absolutely mattered in enabling the internet to come into being, but let's do another panel on that. The contrast I wanted to make was the internet's history is different. The internet started as a government project. In fact, everybody seems to gloss over as we talk about the magic of demand and the demand pull economy here. The internet was a government project for 30 years before it was mostly a private sector project. It was administered, it was funded, it was operated by government contracts. And then in 1994, when it really took a while, but 1994 was sort of a pivot point for me, and I had a front row seat for it because it was the year that I graduated from grad school. The US government decided to effectively get out of the business of moving packets around. Moving IP packets around, and turned it over to the private sector in a I would call a brilliant stroke of industrial policy, which is carefully thought out to try to prevent partitioning of the network as that transition occurred. However, in 1994, it was essentially an inflection point. It was, let's turn this over to the private sector. We don't want to be competing with the private sector. We're also just coming off the heels of the antitrust, as Geoff says, the breakup of AT&T in 1984, which also took about 40 years to effect. So Geoff's right, these things take a very long time. And I wouldn't say they're, however, I wouldn't say they're only in the face of, only as a result of what users are demanding. Although yes, there were many lawsuits in play before that breakup of AT&T happened, and that was antitrust. Now, since then, I would argue, we've taken the pendulum all the way to the other side. We more or less haven't had an antitrust case against anything related to IT in about 50 years. So if you don't enforce antitrust, the laws that were put in place to prevent this sort of monopolization of the marketplace, you're going to have consolidation, and we have consolidation in every sector. So I think before we say the internet's special here, we have to look at history. And again, as Geoff says, what are the laws that are put in place to handle monopolization? And it's not just monopolization. You have to demonstrate abuse of market power, and not just market power. Market power is fine. It's a sign of a successful company. So to Narani's first question about what regulation needs to be put in place, I don't think you start with that question. I think you start with what are the harms that you see that you're trying to address with regulation. And then of course you need to know, how do you assess, how do you measure harm? So I get to come full circle back to where is the data? And if you say, well, I don't have enough data to know if this was a harm, that's the first regulation you need to put in place, is how do you get data to inform policy? So you're not just throwing regulation in that's going to have guaranteed to have unintended consequences. Sarah,
if I may, I really want to pick up on a point that that Casey was making there, and that was this remark. Before we say the internet is special, we need to recognize that this is a pattern that we see elsewhere. One of the things that bothers me a great deal about a number of things that people say about the internet, including this, is the architecture going to break? It really has to do with the fact that we keep acting as though the technology is, because it's transformative, it's completely unprecedented. But the patterns that we see of sort of local stability in patterns even though you have a very large, somewhat stochastic system, is that's not an unusual pattern in built systems. And the fact that we've got economic self-interest going on here among companies that are consolidating and getting larger and larger is not something to do with the internet. That has to do actually with the way the firm works and the way modern firms work and the decisions that we've made culturally and societally about what we're going to tolerate in terms of corporate behavior. So I think I want to separate from the question of like the internet architecture or whether it's designed properly, or the point that Joe is making in the question, Joe Adley is making in the questions, whether there's an architecture at all, since it's really just an agglomeration of stuff that happened. I think I want to separate that from the question of like, are these giant combines, dangerous? Maybe there is something about the internet, or maybe about the web, that tends to encourage monopoly. I think there's an argument to be made that web services tend to discourage open standards because it's easier to build an API over HTTP, and so you just end up with an integrated service. I can see a way to make that argument, and that's an enabling technology for sort of vertical integration that tends to encourage that kind of thing. And it has consequences for the design of the network, and it has consequences economically. And we need to separate those things from one another in our policy discussions, because if we don't separate those things, we're going to start trying to fix the technology through government action of regulating large companies. And that's not going to solve the problem of the large company. And it's also not going to get us a better network architecture. So we're going to fail in all of the terms that we're setting out for ourselves. And so that, I think that's a really key insight that Casey made, and I want to highlight it.
Yeah, great, thank you. So I do want to move us not just forward a little bit, but I also want to pick up on a few of the great points made in the chat and in the Q&A. So I saw Vint Cerf saying like the internet's like the bumblebee. Scientists say that they can't fly. And also you picked up on Joe Adley's point saying that the internet was constructed in an incremental ad hoc fashion, in many ways as a workaround for the fact that a centralized telephony network was not meeting the needs of the people who are using it. And architecture is usually something you have before you start building something. Why do we keep talking about an internet architecture if it's as if the shape of the network in 2020 was something somehow pre-planned and organized? And I think that's a good point to make. I think I do want to pick up on so we talked a little bit about the sort of the market and what drives change and also the need for regulation. But I want to pick up on Andrei Robachevsky's question in the Q&A, and it's particularly interesting, I think, coming from him. So Andrei works at ISOC, and he's also, he started this MANAs, the mutually agreed norms for routing security, which is a program that gets networks, but also IXPs and others to commit to doing some sort of routing security. And it's voluntary driven, sort of very community-based effort. And Andrei says, fair enough, the internet was driven by demand, but as a distributed system of independent players, it is cursed by negative externalities, information asymmetry, and moral hierarchy. Collective action problem. What needs to happen to fix these? Does anyone want to take that on?
I can take the middle one on because it's the easiest. You can reduce information asymmetry by making more information available. that's a
right. But I think that
there's an economic issue behind this that actually is almost fundamental to what's going on. Because if the only source of money is users, and it's a highly competitive marketplace, then the winner is the one that understands the users best. And so the emergence of the combination of computers and computing and this enhanced ability for data analysis, because we just keep on making better machines, actually created the surveillance economy. The surveillance economy was never a government invention, it was a commercial invention, because the best thing I know about you right now, Narani, is what you're going to spend money on in the next hour, day, lifetime. And the more I understand you, the more I can target suggestions at you that influence that purchase, and the more valuable you are. And so we created an economy based around surveillance of users because computers can do that. And so when we talk about user demand, we talk about user demand, but at the same time, we have to recognize that supermarkets are an incredibly controlled experience that turn consumer demand into consumer subtle consumer influence and suggestion. And so we're seeing exactly the same changes on the internet. And one could argue the drive to encryption is not about third parties looking over your shoulder and being deeply interested in you and me. It's more about competitors looking over Facebook's shoulder, trying to figure out what Facebook learned about me, or Google, or anyone else. And this is all about competitors trying to push up the walls between competitors who are all indulging in trying to understand the profile of my future purchases. And so the encryption wars are not necessarily all about the big bad, name your favorite government agency, but actually more about the fact that the folk in the application world are deeply suspicious of the platform folk. If this application is running on this Apple iPhone, does that mean, does that mean that Apple know all of my secrets? Is Apple sort of spying on Facebook? Geez, maybe we should encrypt everything so Apple can't see. And so what you actually get is this perversion of user demand into user surveillance. And at that point, we're scaring the very people whose money we're deeply interested in. And this sort of resistance to this over-enthusiastic market becomes a phenomenal sort of complication in today's world. I see Jari's got his hand up with that.
You done? Yeah, so I fully agree with you, Geoff. And that is actually one of the worrying things in the current situation, that we're very focused on, or the industry is very focused on, we're going to protect my thing. And the industry thinks about it from their perspective. But it's not necessarily the same as the user's thing, or they're not necessarily protecting the user so much as they're protecting themselves. And I would classify this interest in doing only communication security as being part of that. And it's been sort of an uphill battle trying to get people to adopt some other things that would be maybe protecting more of the data leaks that would happen at the server. And that's where most of the data leaks today happen on the internet. But I actually also wanted to go back to Andre's question. I think it was a little bit. So, and I think one of the problems in discussing this kind of thing in this panel and elsewhere is that we have these examples that, well, surveillance or IPv6 or DNSSEC, but that's not the whole picture. Like, we should actually sort of systematically analyze all of these things. Like, we see a lot of evolution in the web space. There's a user demand for that. We see evolutions in many other parts of the technology, whether it's mobile technology or multimedia communications, like enabling these kinds of video calls that we have now. But in many of the infrastructure things, like addressing a routing security, there's maybe a little bit less progress. And that's essentially, this is the spinach that Andrew was talking about. Like, I actually like spinach, and I like IPv6, and I like routing security, but not necessarily a lot of people feel the same, or at least it's not the marketable thing that people will buy this quarter. But it's actually like spinach. It's good for your health, so you should eat it for long lifetime. But and the same in the internet. Like, we should actually have some of these security things, and we should maybe have a little bit more addresses so that we can actually prolong this thing longer. No, we're gonna do the quarterly thing and sell the most fancy app this month. That's the problem.
Well, I want to draw on that though. Hang on. Because I think that Casey was making a really important point about data in response to what Andre was saying. And I think, Jari, this is part of the answer to the dilemma that you're talking about.
I agree.
If you want people to eat more spinach, you can't nag them to eat more spinach. What you have to do is make spinach delicious. And so if you want, this is the point of manners, right? That if you want people to deploy some sort of meaningful routing security in their systems, you have to make it plain that they're doing it and what they're going to do when it doesn't work and what they're going to do when they fail and all the rest of it. And that's what the Manners Project is all about, actually exposing that kind of information to one another. So when Casey says, hey, if you want to solve this, some of these problems, give people more information, give people more data, look at the results. The problem that we have is that people don't have those tools right now. Now, maybe, as Geoff was saying, okay, well, there's a corporate interest in not giving them the data, in keeping the data private, in doing the analysis, for the benefits of my corporation, and keeping you in the dark about what I'm doing with respect to you and my profile of you. But what that really amounts to is an information asymmetry that we really can solve collectively. We actually can solve as a society. We can say, no, actually, I get to know these things, and you don't get to keep it a secret. And under those circumstances, people have more data and they can push back. They can do what Manners has done for routing security and shine some light on it. Because what's going to happen, for instance, in the routing security area, the whole point of getting that information to people is that, once again, you put the control back in the hands of the individual networks, and they can make decisions. Oh, look, this network just misannounces things all the time. Maybe I'm not going to accept their announcements every time because they're a lousy operator. And over time, that puts the pressure on the operator to get better and to do the become a better operator. That's how you do it. Because if you don't have that exposure, other people will not make the right decisions, and that's really what we need across the internet.
I agree, of course. Go ahead.
No, I want to challenge that a little bit in that, is it really only a matter of not having the right data and understanding that spinach is good for you? Because isn't there also tension between what the individuals in the marketplace are pushing for and what is collectively good for us? So IPv6 is one of those examples. If I have enough addresses for my organization, there's no interest for me to push for IPv6. But collectively, IPv6 is what's needed to continue to carry the growth of the internet. And there's a certain element of that in routing security as well. There's a difference between eating spinach because it's good for me and it will take 5 minutes, even if I don't like it, and there will be other benefits that only I benefit from, and doing things that are good for the internet, they're good for the global population, if you want, they're good for my fellow citizen. So is it really just a matter of data, or is there not a tension between these two concepts? I see, Geoff, you shaking your head.
Yeah, right. You've kind of pressed a few buttons here, and so let's start thinking and talking about that. IPv6 is a 1990s solution to a 1980s problem. And it doesn't actually offer any innovation anymore. So what went wrong? And I even argue routing security is a 20-year-old sort of problem and a 10-year-old solution, and we've worked around it. Orchestrated action is incredibly difficult. The supply chains are long. The committee meetings, the IETF working group, the average age of an IETF RFC in gestation is now over 2.5 years. We are as slow as the folk we threw bricks at 20 years ago because there's a lot of us. It's a huge industry and action is incredibly slow and incredibly tedious. So actually what happens is that we identify a problem and we all sit around in a room and start working on the solution, but we're not the only folk working on the solution. And so at some point, wow, where you go to is the reason why you believe what you hear was the problem that routing security was meant to solve. Along comes transport level security, TLS, certificates, that whole infrastructure that says, who cares where you go to? The information you get and the veracity of that information is way more important. Let me solve your problem a different way. And so addresses were scarce. What did we actually do? We didn't all run v6. We changed the architecture of the internet to client server and said to all your clients, you don't need addresses. Go and borrow one from the pool. It doesn't matter. NATs weren't evil. NATs are pragmatic. And it was a pragmatic, innovative solution to a problem that was taking the core of the industry, well, as it turns out, 30 years not to solve. And so these large-scale orchestrated solutions, and we've seen a lot of them, and I'd actually argue DNSSEC sits in the same bucket, become tediously weighed down because our orchestration processes are as primitive as they were 2,000 years ago. You know, it's just hard. And what actually happens is then that the problem still remains. It gets solved in completely different ways. And the folk who work on solutions like that, that's not the solution. The solution is our solution. We all got to run v6. Whereas in reality, the world has moved on. And you know, you're arguing about what color the horse is. It doesn't matter anymore. And so understanding in some ways that sometimes the course of action is not through collective orchestration, but simply through a potential competitor gaining an edge in innovation and simply taking the market with them. It actually is what happens. And so in some ways, the internet is a combination of the two. Along comes this orchestrated effort of IETF working groups, requirement specification, let's all work on the solution, versus someone going, oh, I don't have to do it that way. What if I layer it up inside the DNS? Because the future, by the way, of the entire internet is the DNS, because that's the only protocol that's guaranteed to get everywhere. So, you know, all you HTTP folk, nah, forget it. The future is the DNS. Whatever the problem is, just put it in the DNS and it'll just work.
All right, I do want to, I think we're just getting to as always, we're just getting to a very interesting point in the discussion, and we're coming up to the hour, and I am conscious of people's time, but since we're coming to the end of the discussion, I want to focus a little bit on the future challenges. I want to throw in, though, I see that Vint Cerf has commented that there was and is a layered architecture of protocols. And it was deliberately open-ended. If you see it as ad hoc, that's your privilege. But I would argue it was and is a thoughtful framework for adaptability to new needs. So I think I take that point. But so if we move on to what we see as the current challenges of the internet, but maybe also specifically, because I know there was a comment from Dave Crocker as well that maybe we can spend some time talking about the possible limits of internet technology. So I'd like actually, and this is a question to all of you, what do you see as the main challenges today, but also looking forward, if we look 10 years ahead to the internet and to the internet technologies that we're using, and what can we collectively do to tackle those challenges? It's a very big one, I realize, but I'll throw it out to all of you.
I want to call out a paragraph in Jari's essay that you guys sent out, because I think it addresses Dave Crocker's question really well. I appreciate the frustration that everything ends up back in political economy, Dave, but that is the problem with trying to get technologies to deploy, as Geoff noted in his talk. But Jari made a really cool, drew a cool insight in his essay about how some protocols have learned from the difficulty, some protocol development efforts, I would say, from the difficulty of getting v6 and DNSSEC deployed. And he used TLS and Quick as examples where the designers, and this was designed by committee to some extent, some, you know, as IETF committees go, working groups. But of course, there were big players in there that could help move things along, and also that recognized how the market works, not just how the users work. And that there was going to be a need for incentive to deploy this. So if you really wanted the security functionality to get deployed, you're going to need to also do something that users care about even more than security, which is performance. So to your point about, you know, has the internet hit its limits on scaling performance, reliability, adaptability, usability? I think that my answer would be no, from what I can see. But you, of course, have to think very carefully about what you're going to try to deploy, because you're going to have to go deploy it in a prevailing political economy. So sorry to put economics back in the end of the answer, but that's where we are.
Well, I have a few things that I want to pick up on there, and I see Jim Reed is asking, how do we explain that the internet's doing just fine in a fora where powerful and well-funded and vested interests are saying the very opposite? And then I thought it was interesting, Rudolf van der Berg was saying, question for Casey, is there data that shows that certain things are really broken and need fixing in layer 1, 2, 3? So that's to you, Casey, but then I'd like to pull in everyone else as well to follow from that.
So there's 2 questions there, but yes, the short answer, sorry, I didn't get to Rudolph. I was going to email him later. Yes, there is data to show that things are broken and need fixing at layer 1 to 3, although there's not good data about routing. We've been talking about the need for routing security for, as Geoff says, 30 years and been working on it. But what we do is we work on these technical must-have global deployment problems, and to Jari's point, we sort of forget about the political economy in which that thing is going to have to get embedded. Now, I think what Internet Society did is exactly recognizing that problem when they launched Manners, which is, okay, we're not going to get everybody to deploy whatever we want, so let's figure out if we can create some operational practices that if you deploy it and the fact that you deployed it can be verified, then you improve the level of security, at least for the folks who have deployed it. Now, spoofers and source address validation is an interesting collective action problem. And again, the internet is not special. There are collective action problems all over every economy, and we deal with them the way we deal with other collective action problems. So I think this stance about internet exceptionalism and the protocols are going to fix everything and the architecture is going to fix everything are part of the problem, that way of thinking, not part of the solution. We can't fix everything with the protocol, not this kind of protocol anyway.
Thanks for that. Anyone else wants to? Please go ahead.
I think you need to understand that the silicon industry is now pumping out, I think it's close to 8 billion new processors every year. Human beings are nowhere near capable of achieving that goal of reproductive volume. And what's actually going on is that if you look at areas like the DNS, it's actually machine intelligence and machine communication. I use the words machine intelligence advisedly because I think in some ways it's a contradiction in terms. But we've been used and we've built systems for high touch, high value. We talk about users as humanoids. We talk about placing an intrinsic huge amount of value in these kinds of transactions because our time is valuable, our eyeball space, our brain space is valuable. But we are being overrun by an entirely different model, where a domain name is merely a token used by a piece of silicon for a single nanosecond transaction. I need to do another, give me another domain name. And once we start to automate our world, as we inevitably are, and look at the processes involved in this, we're actually going to find that we bring down the unit costs to the point that the existing marketplaces across most of the internet get destroyed. Because if I can reduce the unit cost, not by a factor of 2, not by a factor of 10, but by a factor of 1 million, then the incumbents have nowhere to hide. We've destroyed that market as a human market. And I kind of look at this and go, wow, maybe Stephen Hawking really was right, that it's a silicon-based issue. And the inexorable volumes, and despite the fact we're lousy coders, if we write enough code, some of it will be right. Some of the 737s will take off and keep in the air, great, as long as we launch enough of them. And that to my mind, if you're looking at where the future of this lies, it's not in cleverer users and it's not in catering to our needs more. Oddly enough, it's about more pieces of silicon that we wear that sort of exist in our life that actually start to dominate our communications network. And the economics of my luggage tag is going to be way, way more important than the economics of my eyeballs, because there are billions of luggage tags and just one of me. And despite the fact the unit cost goes down, the volume goes way high. And it's the same inexorable economics that led to the success of the penny post in 1850.
So going back, I'm sorry, I'm going to force us back to actually try to look at the future and look at.
But I did.
What
You just don't like it.
But so if we try to, I like to do round actually, and I realize that again, it's very difficult to cover such big topics in such a short space of time. But if you look at the coming 5 to 10 years, what do you think the main challenges are, and what can we do to tackle them? And to get a bit of structure, I'll go around the room. So I'll throw the first one at you, Andrew.
Oh, okay. Look, if I had a really good crystal ball, I'd probably be much richer than I am. And that tells me that I need to be leery of making hard predictions about this. But I will say something about this limit question that Dave Crocker was asking, because I think it's important to sort of address, if we think that the future is going to happen, in various ways, like it's got these limitations or whatever, what do we do about it? What Geoff was just saying a few minutes ago sounds like a bug, but I wonder why it isn't a feature. Often we talk about things in the internet, you hear about various cell phone providers, for instance, manufacturers, being an ecosystem. And yet they're not ecosystems, right? They're centrally controlled. They're parks, they're planned, they're walled gardens, etc. But the internet, which weirdly we talk about as having an architecture, is much more like an ecosystem. Stuff evolves in order to deal with the realities of some problem that somebody has. And rather than treating that as a serious issue with, violating the architecture, naughty, maybe what we should do is embrace that as the feature that has allowed the internet to adapt to the problems that it faces, and to ignore the things that the architecture astronauts decided are going to be good for you. DNSSEC didn't not get deployed merely because it's a collective action problem. It also did not get deployed because it just wasn't hard, it just wasn't bad enough. IPv6 would have taken off if we hadn't invented some other way to solve the same problem, because the desire to connect is very strong. And it's just that the cost of deploying IPv6 was so much worse than just natting like 9 times along the path that you did it that way. And so I think that if we treated this as a sort of ecosystem problem, then the limitations of the technology that Dave is asking about are not actually limitations of the technology that are inherent to like whether this can scale indefinitely. The real question is, what are the pressures that are going to cause the evolution in various ways? And then finally, I would say, if we think that some of those pressures are bad for the internet or bad for humans, like for instance, because there's still roughly half the world's population that isn't connected, well, we are also creatures in our ecosystem. We are creatures in this connectivity ecosystem. And the things that we do can affect the system that we're in. So if you think that, connectivity is a bad enough problem, come and join the Internet Society and we'll, continue working on connectivity, because that's what we do. There are ways to address this, but the ways to address it have to address the realities of what the internet offers us. And I fear that what people are doing is moving away from the offering that the internet makes to us, and instead trying to use it as a tool of control and so on. And that's what worries me much more actually than scaling limits of the technology. I don't think that the technology is really the thing to be afraid of here.
All right, thank you. And then on to you, Casey, and especially since we're talking about data here as well, and based on your research, what do you think the main challenges are today and for the future, and what do we do to tackle them?
Well, I'm focused on the internet architecture, because we all know there's lots and lots of challenges above at the layer 7 and above, I guess. But the architecture where I really focus, and again, I'll try to give a better answer to Rudolph's, is there data at layer 1 to layer 3. Where the problems seem to be, and I think this is why we keep making Dave unhappy and not talking about the technology, that the problems seem to lie in scaling the governance of the technology. That the technology is fine, but fundamentally there are places in the technology where you absolutely need some sort of global governance in order for the technology to work. That is true for BGP. That is true for, well, less so hierarchical governance for BGP, but of course we're running into exactly that problem with the RPKI and the deployment of some kind of routing security that right now has to assume some kind of hierarchical framework, and we're all gnashing teeth about what's the right way to approach that, or can we get around there needing to be a hierarchical framework. For DNS, obviously we have a hierarchical framework that's rooted at ICANN, and to Rudolph's point, ICANN themselves publish monthly reports about DNS abuse, where I think a recent one had something close to 1 million domain names that were known to be, or at least reported to have been serving abusive activities. So as a community, the apparatus put in place to sort of manage security and stability of the namespace is really failing to address DNS abuse. And I would argue that it's not something that community can address on its own. But yes, there is good data to show that there's a problem. The problem is related to governance, not technology. It's not a problem, I would say, that's unique to the internet space, although we can certainly find unique aspects of the problem. So we're going to have to go look at other modes of solving that problem, as we've solved other similar problems in other domains.
Thanks, Casey. And Geoff, on to you.
You know, when you say look forward 20 years, I look back 20 years and go, would my 20-year younger self ever have predicted the fact that these smartphones would have completely taken over the world? Would my 20-year-old younger self ever have predicted that radio-based mobile IP would have even had a vague hope of working, you know, and so on? That a lot of the things that happen don't happen through orchestrated, deliberative process, that actually happen by shock, that happen by surprise. And I am as good now as I was 20 years ago in predicting the next 20, because I was wrong then and I'm going to be wrong now. You know, that's just obvious. And so most of these deliberative processes are going to get shocked by something that we never thought about, that someone else's bright idea is just going to take and seize a market and move elsewhere, totally. And that's a really good thing, because quite frankly, a world where my future is charted, my life is charted with absolute precision and certainty is an incredibly boring place. And so this kind of dynamic activity, these kinds of shocks, the continuous feed in of the new disaster of the day is actually what keeps most of us engaged in this industry. It's the surprise factor that drives us all. And whether we're trying to gather data as to what the hell just happened, why did it happen, or whether we're actually trying to predict what will consumers want tomorrow is actually what's going on here. So do I think that we're actually more empowered to disrupt each other? Well, I'd like to think so. I'd like to think that while the internet has been really good for solving pub arguments as to, you know, who was the person behind AT&T and when did they live? And so, well, Google will tell me that. Google will tell me everything. But this empowering model where users and people actually have greater ability to change, alter, and actually disrupt their environment is perhaps bigger now than ever before. And that's the empowering element. That while we see a future of the internet that's incredibly machine dominated, I actually think the power of innovation still rests with people, and empowering people, no matter where they are or how, is actually the true strength here. So am I willing to predict 20 years? You don't want to hear me, because I know for a fact I'm wrong. Even before I say a single word, I'm going to be wrong.
So I was going to scold you for dropping all these bombs and then basically saying that you can't predict the future, but you got a little bit inspirational there at the end with saying that the
I try.
That's lovely to see still. So that on that very positive note, I think Jari, you can feel free to share your thoughts on the future and see if you can match Geoff's positive conclusions there.
Maybe I'll take the negative approach this time then. No, I think I'm actually quite optimistic, but we do have some challenges. I think Geoff is of course right in that we can't fully predict. I mean, it's the unpredictableness that's interesting here. But if I had to guess, I would, first of all, I would not worry too much about like covering everybody's internet access. I think that will happen. I think the industry is on that path. it won't take too many years and we're there. We should worry more about other stuff. And in that other stuff category, in my mind, at the moment, without those surprises known, is user data and the fate of that. And secondly, various forms of consolidation and how they impact the whole market or ecosystem. And also wanted to just briefly mention that, you know, sometimes when stuff doesn't get deployed, maybe there's actually a reason, like you're not offering what people actually want. DNSSEC was mentioned a few times, and that was about the integrity of data, as Geoff, I think, pointed out, that got solved in or at least partially solved in other ways. Later on, people moved to like, okay, we actually don't care about that so much. We care about the privacy of the data, like privacy of what are you asking against other parties, and that got solved. I think we are on a path to realize that, wait, you know, if we actually care about privacy, then the leaks are more on the server side, not on the communications path, and we'll have to figure out an answer for that as well in the future. And in terms of how to get there, I think agreeing with Casey, you mentioned measurements and understanding what's going on in data. That's hugely important, but also like not just like numerical quantitative measurements, but also qualitative understanding of, like, you know, what information is where, who has what power, what connections are there in this ecosystem, and what can we actually change. Those things are important, and I think we should have more of this understanding, like what, you know, how can we actually deploy things, how can we, you know, what do people actually need and are willing to consume and pay for. And unfortunately, not everything that we do, you know, whether it's, you know, current proposals in this or that standards organization, are fully aware of that. But yeah, I think the ones that will actually understand some of this stuff will be able to deploy things, and others maybe not so much. So it's important.
Okay, thank you. I just very quick comment on what you just said. I think I don't know about optimism, but maybe you captured the Finnish sentiment of sisu, which is this sort of tenacity, this not optimistic, I don't know, but this sort of concept of grit and we'll get there if we work through it. And maybe that's a good way to end this discussion. I apologize to all the people who are in the virtual microphone line. I see that there is a very long line of people asking questions. There were all sorts of questions about IoT, about our endless consumption of energy on this planet. How will we deal with that? The impact of 5G, but we needed to keep this panel somewhat limited in scope. And I think it just shows that it generated a lot of thoughts and questions in the audience. So instead of maybe apologizing for not getting to all the questions, maybe we should say thank you for generating so many good questions in the audience. And hopefully we'll take these discussions on to new forums, or maybe another discussion of this similar nature that we're happy to host at LINX again in the future. So I would like to say that from my perspective, I thought it was an incredibly interesting discussion. It feels like we dipped into a lot of different things. There's a lot more to explore, certainly. Thanks to all of you who participated and asked questions live, and of course, any one of you who watch it afterwards. Please do keep an eye out on the LINX website for upcoming presentations and tutorials. We have some really interesting speakers and talks coming up, so make sure to register for those now. You'll also be able to watch this and any other of the past talks on the LINX website and the LINX YouTube channel. So with that, thank you again. A very special thank you to Casey. I'll do a little applause here since we don't have a room, to Andrew, to Jari, and to Geoff. So thank you very much for taking the time to share your expertise, your insight, and your interesting perspectives. And thank you particularly to Geoff and Casey for doing this at an ungodly hour in your time zone. So it's been a real pleasure listening to you. The discussion will continue in other forums, I'm sure. Until then, be well, stay healthy and safe, and hope to see you all soon again. Thank you.
So much.
Thank you.